Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Today we should have a great show ahead. Thank you yet again for tuning in. I appreciate all the support you guys are giving me right now. Like I said, we should have a great show again today. We are previewing and going over betting odds for both finals games in the NBA and in hockey with the Stanley Cup Finals. Then we are going to look into kind of another interesting series of segments where I'm going to be dissecting why both of our leaders in these finals, namely the Celtics and the Panthers, are such confusing fantasy teams due to the fact they are such well-built teams and structured around a system rather than one superstar player. And then stick around for the end of the show where the Euros will make their triumphant return, and for the first time ever, I'll be previewing one specific team in terms of their fantasy implications, and that will be England. We will continue this series as the week goes along and as the Euros start up on Friday. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you guys yet again to please like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you are so willing. Also, if you do feel so inclined, we do receive a lot of tips and donations, so do consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and especially the network, so anything you give is greatly appreciated. Also, if you're curious about something I said this episode and you want to leave a question, I will answer that at the beginning of next episode, so consider that if you will. Without further ado, let's get into another very exciting show. We begin, as we always do, with a little bit of basketball talk. We have to. It's the NBA Finals. Everyone is hyped. And this seems like a very pivotal kind of Game 3 in terms of both fantasy odds and what it means for both teams as they head into this kind of stretch of the series where things can change in an instant or the Celtics can take advantage. Obviously, they lead 2-0 right now. But in this Game 3, anything can happen. Let's just go over the money lines and the betting odds for this game because I think they're really interesting. For the first time in this series, Dallas is favored in a game as the series shifts back to them. They are favored by 1.5 points. The over-under kind of low for this game as it has not necessarily been in the past two. That's 212.5 points. And as we look at the money lines, Boston is plus 105. Dallas minus 125. So kind of a weird money line there where it certainly favors Dallas, but not by as many as people think. However, I do think that this is a very pivotal game, both for fantasy and for Dallas in real life, like I said. So let's look into the fantasy implications for this game and how much these players will be sending you back in your daily fantasy basketball squad. Luka remains the king of fantasy basketball in this series, costing you a pretty penny as always. 13.8K on DraftKings, projected to have a whopping 62.8 fantasy points. And interestingly enough, the top fantasy prospect for the Celtics is Jason Tatum. Very scrutinized, like we said on this show, but he continues to over-exceed expectations. He's sitting at 11.6K in terms of budget on DraftKings, and he's projected to have 51.5 fantasy points. A player who certainly benefited from his performances in this series. Drew Holiday is sitting at 7K, a little bit pricier than maybe he was coming into this series, and is projected to have 33.8 DraftKings fantasy points. And here's a guy from the Mavs who I really think can get going, especially if we're going to talk about this a little later in the segment. A certain player from the Celtics is out, and that is Derek Lively II. He's projected to have 18.3 fantasy points, but in the past two games he has not cracked double digits at all. And that brings us into kind of the game plans for both of these teams. Obviously, I really think the Mavs, if they're going to win any game, it is this game. They have the home court's advantage right now. They want to look to take one, if not two, of these games, make it a little bit tougher on the Celtics, especially now that, like I said, Kristaps Porzingis is now day-to-day. Obviously, he wants to play. He's dying to play out there, literally saying that. But it sounds like Joe Mazzulla saying it's a very serious, weird injury that they're going to have to monitor, and it's not up to Kristaps whether or not he's going to play. So it is definitely up in the air, much like he was for the entirety of the playoffs. So, that kind of changes things for Dallas because, like I said, the reason I'm picking Derek Lively is because of Porzingis' health. If Porzingis is not healthy or not fully fit for this game, expect Luka and Derek Lively's lob game to come back. That has been something that the Celtics have been able to shut down ever since Kristaps Porzingis was reintegrated into the team in the NBA Finals because of the fact of his height and length being an issue for these young up-and-coming Dallas defenders. I said the fact that Kristaps Porzingis coming back would offer a nice little intriguing matchup, but Kristaps ultimately has dominated it to the point where Derek Lively has not been a prominent fantasy player you guys can rely on in your daily fantasy basketball squad. So, should Kristaps Porzingis not be healthy or sit out its entirety of the game, Derek Lively, I expect, will be a lob game because let's think about how Dallas is set up for this series. They have kind of been going through Luka a lot more than usual. Obviously, they always do, but Luka has been the one trying to bring the ball up to court and ultimately has not been to any avail because the Celtics have stayed the course, sticking with their perimeter shooters, shutting down what has led Dallas to this point, and that is the corner three. But right now, Luka Doncic as a distributor can kind of integrate Dan Gafford and Derek Lively a little bit more into this Dallas offense, whereas that kind of lane was shut down by KP's emergence. And so I truly expect my bold prediction is going to be that Dallas will struggle with the corner threes yet again due to the fact that Joe Mazzulla is not going to strain away from what has helped the Celtics defensively in this series. But I think that opens up the passing lane for Luka Doncic and Dan Gafford and Derek Lively. Now notice how I did not mention Kyrie. I think Kyrie's struggles extend to this kind of disbelief in himself and mainly his head not being in it right now. I think that this is a much more mental issue for Kyrie than it is anything physical. I think he definitely has the capabilities to have a breakout game. I hope I'm proven wrong because Kyrie Irving has just been such a dazzling player for so many years in this league, and I wish him the best at what he does, but right now I don't think Kyrie Irving just looks right or feels right in the slightest. I think that he's kind of in this muddled mindset where I know he's saying that the Boston crowd didn't necessarily affect him as much as he thinks it did, but it certainly is kind of emblematic of his divorce, this shaky divorce from the Boston Celtics organization. So Kyrie in this game is certainly going to be someone to watch due to the fact that maybe him being back in Dallas can bolster his spirits and help him play a little bit better. But still, Kyrie Irving, I think there's something mightily wrong with the way he's playing. But looking at kind of the Celtics players who I think are going to step up, obviously, no one truly knows who's going to be the best Celtics fantasy player. We'll discuss that in a later segment. But I do still think that Jason Tatum, obviously, you can kind of put him down for not being the player you want him to be in a final series, but he's still very impactful in the way they play. He's a contributor. He's a facilitator. He doesn't necessarily have to put up points if he's dishing out assists to Boston's more role player kind of players. And so Jason Tatum being selfless, yes, you kind of don't want him to be if you're a fantasy player, but in terms of fantasy, assists and rebounds are still integral parts of how you score points. And so you can't necessarily rid yourself of that fact as much as you want to kind of get behind this whole mindset of, oh, I hate Jason Tatum because he just doesn't produce. He does produce, but in ways you might not necessarily expect from him. And he's been doing it to a T in this finals. And then speaking of Jrue Holiday is such a very weird player because last game in Game 2, his scoring output was so unexpected because he's not known as a scoring point guard. He's known as a guy you kind of uses space to open up other shots for other players and he's mainly more of a facilitator slash defensive stud who kind of does it on both ends of the floors, not by scoring points. But last game really kind of elevated his status as a fantasy player. So should you want a point guard, obviously what with Kyrie Irving struggling, who is not going to score as many points like a person like JT would, but is still one of the better defensive fantasy players, combined with his offensive prowess in terms of assist rate, then Jrue Holiday's your pick. And then extending down the lineup, obviously, if KP plays, that's a huge factor in real life and in fantasy as well. I think he adds value with the blocks and defensive solidity he brings, but still, he's definitely a player up in the air. I don't think it's his decision to make for this game, so we'll have to see with that. And then ultimately, guys like Derek White's going to step up defensively. Jaylen Brown is obviously the heartbeat, the fulcrum of what makes the Celtics tick. So, who knows? I really can't tell you who I think or will be the best Celtics fantasy basketball player tonight, but just know that it could be anyone. That's all I can say. And with that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up, like always, it's just this kind of week as we get into this final spirit. We switch from basketball to hockey, where I will obviously be previewing and going over the betting odds for the Panthers-Oilers game coming up tomorrow night. It's a can't-miss segment, as always, because I love talking hockey with you guys. We'll be right back with that. Should be a very good one.